see in sports is actually a recent Duke grad.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started.
How old is he? Oh, okay.
Thank you
Because
everyone
the
for
Phoenix
coming
or Arizona.
to this panel that's co-sponsored by the Business Law Society and the Sport and Entertainment Law Society. Here with us today we have Mr. Billy Traurig, who's Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the Carolina Hurricanes. He is responsible for managing all legal matters for the Hurricanes in PNC Arena, and he serves as legal consultant to the organization's affiliated entities. He's been there for nearly 15 years, and he's also responsible for accounting and tax management of the entire organization. And we also have Mr. Richard Thigpen, who joined the Panthers in July 1997. He was in private practice beforehand, specializing in healthcare, corporate, and tax law. And while he was in private practice, he provided counsel to the Panthers on a variety of legal matters, including financing and construction of the Bank of America Stadium. So I will let them add anything else they want about their background.
Well, I'm going to insist that you add that you're a Dookie. So
That's right.
what I'm sure this group is going to want to know is how you got into this business. How did you get yourself involved with a team and then become general counsel? Billy, do you have a?
Sure. I started as a kid. I grew up playing hockey, learned to skate at the age of 5, and absolutely loved sports, music. And when I went to undergraduate college at Clark University, I was pretty much on my own for spending money and went to a couple of concerts at what was then called the Worcester Centrum, and realized that my bank account was going to drain really quickly if I kept going to concerts. But I looked around and I saw how much fun the security guards were having and the staff. So I decided I got a job there, part-time, working security. Really enjoyed it, so much so that when I was looking to go back for my MBA, I decided to go back to Clark so that I could work at the arena and leverage that into a full-time position once I graduated. And that's what happened. I ended up working at the Hartford Civic Center as the assistant box office manager while I was still in graduate school, and knew all along I wanted to stay in arenas and sports. Try to make a long story short, I worked at a couple of other arenas in the meantime, and then in the summer of 1999, was at an arena conference and ran into some of the people that I worked with in Hartford, who said that they were now working for the Carolina Hurricanes, which were formerly the Hartford Whalers. They were opening up a new arena in Raleigh, and they were looking for a lot of positions, and would I be interested? So I sent in an application and came down, started on opening night as the finance director for PNC Arena. And then through a series of other events, ended up going to law school part-time at Central in the evenings while working for the Hurricanes, who did not have a general counsel or anyone in-house while I was there. And being on the finance side, I was able to see all of the expenses that we were laying out for legal fees and the trend of how they decreased as I was in law school, and was able to use that to convince our ownership and boss that, and our CFO that it would be a wise idea to invest in a full-time attorney to reduce legal fees. And continued since.
Richard, how did you get involved in this?
I wasn't. Every path is different. Billy's is different. Mine, I was a Duke undergrad. I graduated in '78 when basketball was good, football not so good, but it was a good time to be here. And didn't even intend to go to law school at that point. So I had no thoughts of being a sports lawyer, especially. But did go back to law school a couple years later, got a master's in tax after that, and started working with Moore and Van Allen. And while I was there, the Richardsons came. Jerry Richardson went to his banker friend Hugh McCall and said, "Who do I get for legal advice as I pursue a franchise? Because I'm going to get an NFL franchise." And Mr. McCall and my father had worked together on some things in the past. The World Football League from the early '70s. Charlotte had a team, the Charlotte Hornets, and so my first exposure there was running around putting Hornets bumper stickers on barrels and everything else, trying to get people to come to those games. But anyway, we we started working at Moore Van Allen for the Richardsons. I was one of about 12 attorneys working in that group. They stayed with us when we moved to Pointer and Sproul. And then when we got a franchise, I ran over and told the Richardsons I wanted to come to work for the franchise. It was more interesting than what I was doing, it felt like. And I said, I didn't care if I was in the legal department or not. And they said, no, we would hire you as the attorney if we did, but we want your dad to do it for 4 or 5 years. When he retires, we'll outsource it to you, which is what most teams did at the time. Fortunately for me, in 1997, they called and said, are you still interested in coming over here? And it took a nanosecond to say yes. And I've been there ever since. And when I started in 97, I think 12 teams had in-house counsel, and about a third of those were family members of the ownership group. So it really, for me, it was just being in the right place at the right time, and I hadn't messed it up yet. So that's how I got into it, and it's been great fun.
Do either of you have any thoughts for students who might want to move in this direction about what they can do to optimize the long shot of getting to a team?
I would kind of build off of what Billy's experience was like. You take whatever opportunity you can to get your foot in the door. You get into a position that may not be where you ultimately want to end up, but getting your foot in the door is the hardest part. So if you get an opportunity to work with a firm that represents anything sports related, and you can do some work with the people in that firm that are doing that work, if you get an opportunity to work in a legal department of, say, a bank that does a lot of sponsorship deals, or any other company that does sponsorships in sports, you can get into sports marketing that way. There are tangential ways of doing it, but the important thing is just to get any kind of entry that you can into sports, because there are a very, very limited number of jobs, and there are a whole lot of people that want them. So that's what I would say. And I also would say, if you do apply for a position with a franchise or a league or something like that, it's really not that important to tell them how much you love sports, because they're going to assume everybody's a sports junkie if they want to come work for it. So don't emphasize that you're a big fan. Emphasize that you've got some skills that'll help them out.
Yeah, that's exactly what I tell everybody that I meet with that comes in and asks that question. And the big thing that anybody that's going to hire you, no matter what type of role you're looking at, is what can you do for them, not how will the job benefit you. So that love of sports is really all about you versus what skills can you bring to the table to fill a need that the employer has. As Richard mentioned, just getting in at any level is good, and don't limit it specifically to legal at this point, especially while you're in law school. Look at internships at other departments, such as marketing is one that hires a lot of interns typically, at least on our end and other NHL teams. And that gets you in the door to mingle and meet people and let them know who you are. And it's something to put on a resume as you're sending it out to other teams, just to say, hey, I've been in the world already. And it will definitely help you in some ways.
Before I totally leave this theme, are you seeing movement from sport to sport in management? So football teams are looking at hockey teams are looking at baseball teams to hire people, or are you still seeing this highly siloed effect within the separate leagues?
On the business side, I would say that there is a decent amount of crossover. We had a new president come in a little over a year ago, and when that happens, there's always a lot of turnover. And we've had people come in from the NBA league offices.
Your commissioner came from another sport.
Yes, our commissioner came from the NBA originally. We've had people coming over from minor league and major league baseball teams.
And I would agree. There's a fair amount of crossover. The general counsel for the NFL, Jeff Pash, was in hockey. He was with the NHL for a long time. So it's a portable skill. So again, if you want to be in football, don't hesitate to take an opportunity in hockey, because it's getting you in the right direction, even if it doesn't feel like it.
Now, one thing that I think would also be helpful before we get into some of the more be interesting matters, but what's it like to represent a team and to be a general counsel? What is your day-to-day work? And how is it different from representing, well, I guess you've only represented teams, but you've represented a lot of other clients. How is it different from other kinds of legal representation?
Well, we have about 160 employees, so we have the same issues that any other company does of that size as far as your in-house issues. Where it differs is in some of the other things that I'll address in this morning, for instance. I had to deal with trademark issue, intellectual property issue. A company that we don't have any affiliation with was running something on social media using our logo, giving away our tickets. And so I had to call them up and talk to them about it. And I didn't have any intellectual property background from law school or from private practice. That's something I've had to learn a little bit on the fly. And it's the type of thing where when we're 5-0, I'm a lot busier than when we're 0-5 on protecting our marks. So right now that's keeping me fairly busy, and I had to work on that this morning. Another issue this morning, took a phone call on the way up here, and somebody had called in. They purchased 4 tickets for the game on Sunday, and they're on the 40-yard line in a particular section, and they're in the middle of the section. And they said, by the way, I bought these tickets online, and I've got 3 people with me, and I've got a service dog with me too. And it's not a seeing eye dog; it's just I forget what you call them, a comfort animal or something, but a service dog that they want to bring to the game too. So what kind of accommodation can you make for me? Because we can't, all 4 people and the dog sit in these 4 seats in the middle of this section. It obviously won't work out. So where can you put us? And by the way, we all want to stay together, the 4 of us and the dog, and we expect you to work it out. And it's like, okay. If you learned at all about the Americans with Disabilities Act, you're supposed to make a reasonable accommodation. What's reasonable? The only sure thing that's reasonable is if you offer something that the person accepts as reasonable, and then you don't have a problem. But we don't have seats available, especially right now for a Sunday night game, for 4 people and a dog. We said, we can give you the regular accessible seating where you get your seat and a companion seat, and there'd be room for the dog too, but we can't get your 2 friends there as well. I told our folks, well, you call them back and you say, look, here's a couple of options. One is if we've got them available, and they had to check with the ticket office. If there are 4 seats that they can buy somewhere else, tell them to buy 4 seats and sell the 4 they bought the first time. They shouldn't have bought seats where they couldn't sit. That's really not our fault. That's kind of their fault. But if we've got some others, this is a situation, fortunately, where maybe if they can buy these that we have, and there's a good market for what they have, they'll be able to sell them in a heartbeat. Alternatively, they can wait, and they've got to wait until Saturday probably to know if they can get the other seats. And they're going to be 2 seats, not 4, and they're going to probably be in the corners of the end zone, not on the 40-yard line. But it's all we have available, and that is the accommodation we can make. And if they don't like it, then they'll call the Department of Justice, because we get those calls every now and then. And so far, we've been found to be reasonable in the cases that we've had. But those are the kind of things that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So those were 2 that I dealt with this morning.
Day to day, it's a crapshoot. You really don't know what you're going to walk into, what's going to happen when your phone rings and you answer it. This morning I had walked in with a list of about 3 things that I knew this is what I needed to get done, and not counting the big projects I've got going on. And before I left at 11:30 to come over here, I didn't even touch those 3 because calls from the NHL. I can't comment on any of the specifics of it, but there's a lawsuit going on, and we needed to talk about some of the strategy and how we were going to respond to the judge's order for a league-wide suit. Somebody came up and Richard has the benefit of not having those tickets available and tracking down trademarks when he's 5-0. At 5-1, I've got the ticket sales department coming to me with promotions galore of how do we sell more tickets and what promotions can we run? How can we work with use this sponsor's mark with this promotion? One of them was a tie-in to, I'll tell you, Star Wars and getting a contract from Lucas Entertainment of what are they licensing to us? What are we licensing to them? How can you use the marks? And what are the restrictions on those uses that even though they're giving you the right to use it, what else do you have to do? Such as going around and getting consents from any actors that appear in any video clips you put up on the board. Lucasfilms is giving you the right to show the video, but you still have to get the actors and even these stunt people. You have to get their approval. And if you play any of the music from the film, it's, okay, we don't have a problem with it, but you still have to go to ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC to get the licenses to have the public performance of that music. So all of those things come together, and as Richard said, I took one class on intellectual property in law school. And it's you're learning as you go. It's a lot of being a jack of all trades, while mastering a few as you get deep in and learn them. But that's really what I enjoy, is not knowing what to expect. Having something different on my plate from sometimes hour to hour, minute to minute, not just day to day or week to week.
I think you'll find most in-house attorneys, whether it's with a company in general business or whether it's a sports franchise, that do like that aspect of you're not doing the same thing. I mean, it would be a slow death for me if I looked at loan documents all day, every day for my career. And I've got friends that do that, and they love it. They're good at it, and they like doing that. I couldn't do that. I'm like Billy. I like a little change of pace. There are things that come across our desks that we wish we didn't, but for the most part, it really is interesting.
How much do you deal with the sport specific? You've certainly mentioned the fact that you're in a public business, and the ADA matters would stress that you're in a public business and that you're putting on entertainments and that sort of thing. How much do each of you deal with the sport specific player contract, enforcement of conduct policies, things like that?
I'll tell you, in all the major league professional sports, at least I believe it's all of them, the standard player contract is part of the collective bargaining agreement. So all of your basic terms and conditions are spelled out in there. And for hockey, it literally is you fill in the number of years, you fill in the salary, fill in any allowable bonuses, which are very limited these days in the hockey world under the collective bargaining agreement. And there are a few clauses that we can add that are allowable. Other than that, the player contracts are really a do-it-yourself type of thing that our general manager works on, and we actually now have an assistant GM who's an attorney who does some of those. My involvement with the hockey side of it typically only comes when there's a player grievance, and working with the league to go through those, such as if we have an injury grievance, and working with the Players Association, working with the NHL attorneys, and working through that. That's really my only contact with the actual product.
That's pretty much the same for me. The player grievances, player discipline, sometimes I get involved with, but much to my dismay, workers' compensation takes up a fair amount of my practice too. These are claims by players, and our argument for the first few cases was, look, if you bang yourselves into each other all day, every day, you're going to get hurt. It's not really an injury by accident. It's not, and you don't intend to get hurt, but you're going to get hurt. It's part of the game. And that's not the way the Industrial Commission looks at it. Every injury is an injury by accident, and you got to pay workers' comp benefits for it. So we have lots of claims for workers' comp. When they're still playing, it's not that big a deal because it's just the medical side, which we always pick up anyway. But it's whenever that career ends, whether that career lasted for a week of training camp or for 15 years as an all-pro, whenever it ends, you file a claim and saying your latest, greatest injury was your career-ending injury, and then you get indemnity benefits for some period of time after that. It also got kind of crazy for a while because California ignored the statute of limitations and gave jurisdiction to anybody that had ever heard of the state. And so players were filing claims out there, mass claims. It was incredible. There's a former player who had access to the alumni list, and he was just out beating the bushes for business and filed thousands of claims and did really well. The league actually got California to change their law and say, okay, you really only get California benefits if there's a legitimate connection to the state. If you're a resident, if you signed your contract in the state, or if you played the bulk of your career in the state. So that helped. I mean, we had hundreds of cases out there because we played San Francisco every year for the first 7 or 8 years of our existence. And
we had hundreds of cases as well, dating back to the New England Whalers of the WHA, former players that are in their 80s now. We've gone through a half dozen ownership changes since that time. Records no longer exist, and these players are suddenly saying, hey, this injury that happened to me in 1976 should be covered by workers' comp. And I still get, even with the change in the law, probably about 10 envelopes a week in the mail related to those cases that are outstanding. Just a quick question. How many of you were surprised to hear, by show of hands, that professional sports athletes can get workers' comp?
it's good. Okay. I mean, really, it surprised us too. And then we've paid benefits. It's right now in North Carolina, you can get 10 years worth of benefits. And there's a cap on the amount that you can get because the law was intended to help. It's a safety net for those that are really factory workers, construction workers, people that get hurt on a job. When they're out, they still got to pay their rent and buy their groceries. And so there's a cap on the amount of compensation you get, the dollar amount per week plus the number of weeks you can get it. And it used to be 300 weeks. It's now 500 weeks. So it's like 10 years worth of benefits. So it's worth about $450,000 right now at the maximum benefit. And because of salaries of the athletes, they always qualify for the maximum benefit because they're not going to make as much money in the real world as they do playing sports. So, I mean, we paid 6 years worth of benefits for sprained thumbs twice. I mean, guys that never made the team, but for that sprained thumb, the Industrial Commission said they'd have been, all pro and stayed in the league forever. You do get some funny stories out of it, though. We had one guy a player that I knew, he's a really nice guy, but he said he hurt his knee on a kickoff, and he didn't get hit. He was just kind of running down the field and felt a tweak in his knee, and his attorney argued that his weight shifted outside his body core, and that's what caused the accident, and that's what caused the injury. And, well, how did it impact you? Well, I can run faster with my right leg than I can with my left leg now. And I'm like, okay. And we paid him 6 years worth of benefits after going through that trial. So it's a no-win situation for us, other than we go to mediation. We settle almost all of them in mediation. We paid more than we'd like to, but less than we'd have to if we continued on. Every now and then we'll get something that we can try to leverage, at least to either get a good settlement or we will actually go back to court with it.
One of the oddnesses of your industries is you have a team and the franchise, and that's where the ownership group is, but you're in a league. And how much of your time is spent interacting with the league, dealing with the central office? What kinds of role do you have in advising your ownership about that, or implementing, resisting league matters?
It's an interesting challenge. It's unique. It's a different setup than your
Anything
typical
else.
franchise and than anything because, let's take McDonald's as an example. You've got the Ray A. Kroc company as your franchisor. You go in, you invest money to buy the franchise license, and you operate it totally according to their specs and guidelines, and you'll do whatever they tell you to do. In hockey, in Major League Professional Sports, for the most part, Major League Soccer is a little different, but the franchises, the owners of the individual teams, are the board of governors that govern the league. So it's a circular relationship where the league is dictating things to the teams, but they also have to balance what they're directing to the teams because the owner of the team employs the league office. And each team gets one vote for electing and hiring the executive director or the commissioner of the league. And it's just it's a unique balance. So sometimes in certain instances, you're on the same side as the league, and other times you're on the opposite side of the league. So balancing what information you're able to share with the league office at times can be delicate because you don't know if that information will eventually be involved in something where your interests are at odds with the league. So it's an interesting balance. I deal with the league office. I can go sometimes talking to them multiple times a day to not having contact with someone in the league office for months at a time. It all depends what's going on, what input I need from them. They do a lot of work for us, helping in terms of intellectual property licensing. Anything that is within 50 miles of Raleigh, we're allowed to license. Anything outside of 50 miles of Raleigh and internet-based that reaches out there has to get a league license in terms of trademarks. So we've got to work together on that and what's allowed, what isn't allowed. They give us a lot of guidance on some of those areas that I don't have an experience in and a lot of the others don't have experience in because they've got specialists in just about every area.
And it's similar with us. The trademark work, for example, I'll make the first call on people and ask them to stop what they're doing, explain to them it's illegal, and usually that resolves it. If somebody keeps going and we want to send a cease and desist or pursue it further with a lawsuit, then I'll usually call somebody in New York and get them to write the letter because it carries even more weight when it comes out of the NFL office than when it comes out of mine, and they'll do that for us, which is nice. Our owner is a big league proponent, so we as a club cooperate with the league in almost everything. We have to hold our nose sometimes to do it, but we do it. And
Robert Kraft used to be a big.
He used to be. and part of the problem is though that there is a disconnect, like Billy was talking about. In the New York offices of the league, there's something like 275 employees, and only 4 or 5 of them have ever worked for a club. So I draw the analogy to Washington and the business world. I mean, the folks making the laws in Washington have no clue what the impact is on the rest of the people that they're governing. New York NFL offices are a lot of times the same way. They make all these lovely rules and programs and everything else, and they don't understand how it impacts the club. So there's kind of this tension of, look, we understand what you're trying to get to, but let's get practical about it. Here's a better way to do it. The NFL security guys sometimes run amok, I think, with what they do, and they'll start investigations when they really don't have a whole lot of facts there. And as you alluded to Kraft, I mean, what a fiasco that was about footballs. Both sides could have handled it better, I think, but it's gone on and on and on, and it's ridiculous. So
And the appeal will be heard 8 days before the Super Bowl?
Probably not. I think it'll get postponed, but it's Yeah, it's interesting trying to work in this kind of environment where you're governed by the people that you're supposed to be governing, and trying to figure out which end is up sometimes, and trying to get consistent answers. As the league grows and they move people around, somebody's told you a certain advice forever, and then they move on, and somebody else comes in and they say, no, that's not the way you do it. We actually got fined one time because we redeemed the interest of one of our partners who I guess we redeemed a partial interest. We had redeemed another one years earlier, and the guy at the league we had to deal with, I called. I said, do we need the league consent to do this? Because you have to get NFL consent to transfer ownership interest. He said, no, since you're doing a redemption and there isn't a new owner coming in, it just kind of floats the boat of everybody else. You don't need NFL consent. So the next time we did it, I didn't go back to the league. We just did it. A year later, we get a letter, by the way, you transferred ownership interest without the league's consent. We're going to fine you $500,000 or something like that. It was crazy. And I have to go explain to the owner why we got in trouble on that. And fortunately, I still had a copy of the letter from the first time around that said you don't have to get it, which I showed to the league when they were trying to penalize us. They said, well, sorry, he got it wrong, and we're getting it right this time, and you've got to pay the fine. So it's an interesting business.
Specifically on that, being the lawyer for the ownership group and dealing with the league, how did your offices or clubs react or not react to what happened in the NBA with the threatened termination of an ownership interest? Did that capture people's imagination? Did you start going back and looking at what the security of tenure of your owners were?
Well, in NFL, it's pretty secure. I mean, they can boot an owner. It takes, I guess, 24 votes to do it. Al Davis survived forever in spite of all his lawsuits against the league and other teams. And I think everybody feels like if Al Davis survived it, anybody's going to survive. It would really have to be something egregious for an owner to lose. Yeah, and Sterling, he probably got what he deserved in that regard. And if your other owners go along with that, you know that he did. So,
I mean, we certainly looked into it and started researching all of the different league rules. And we had recently, at the time, we'd gone through some minority investor transactions, so I was pretty familiar with those rules and the flexibility that the league has to come in and actually take over the team, not just say your membership is terminated, but to actually take over and run the team without kicking the owner off. They can force a sale, but the leagues don't want to do that. It's in their best interest, at least publicly, to have the appearance that everything's great. Because as leagues are looking to expand, as teams are for sale, the best interest of the league is make sure everything looks good so that it increase franchise values, because that's what the owners want, is to increase the value of their investments. And the commissioner's number one job is to look out for the best interest of the league as a whole. So they may do things under the table that are not publicized to get an owner under control, but publicly they're going to try to keep a lid on it as much as possible and only do it for extreme circumstances such as Donald Sterling or the Coyotes when they filed bankruptcy without checking with the NHL and without talking to their inside attorney about the ramifications as well.
It talks about the value of the franchise too. It boggles my mind. I mean, we paid $140 million in cash and gave up certain shared revenues. Our purchase price was about $200 million. The latest Forbes estimates, I think NFL average franchise is worth about $1.5 billion, $1.6 billion. The Cowboys are worth something like $4 billion. And there are people lined up to buy franchises that can pay cash for them. I mean, I don't know where these people come from, but I wish I were one of them, but they're out there, and it's fascinating to me that people do this because they don't, especially if you pay that kind of money. There's no cash flow on it for the owners on much of a return. You hope the values keep building, but it's a crazy business. It really is. It's unlike anything you'll find in any other industry, I think.
And football at least makes money. Most of your NBA and NHL teams are still losing money. So those owners, the increase in the franchise value is their return. And when they sell is when they get that return.
When you were talking about increase in value, when the four Rooney brothers sold, it was determined that their tax basis in the team was $3,500.
Yeah.
So the increase has been pretty dramatic.
It's been pretty dramatic. Yeah. It's been in the family a long time. I think the Mara family, I think, beats them. I think their basis is $1,500, but the rest of them, it's just crazy.
Before we leave the franchise league issue, how have the personal conduct policies affected your operations? You talked about the league investigation, but just how the league is responding to your employees when there is a scandal.
Well, the league, I'll take it first. I mean, because I got a call 16 months ago about Greg Hardy, and had to deal with that. And the NFL over the last couple of years has really struggled with cracking down on player behavior and domestic violence in particular. And it's a good thing that the focus has come out, but it's also created some really interesting dynamics between the league and the clubs and the players. And the league has hired, I don't know, half a dozen former prosecutors to do these investigations where every time there's any allegation of any kind of domestic violence or inappropriate behavior, they launch into these investigations. And I had to sit with a player just a couple of weeks ago on something that had happened months ago and was relatively minor, but the person doing the investigations had one more box to check off, so they have to get somebody from the union to fly in and sit with the guy, and I got to do, and it takes up everybody's time so they can check that box and move on. Now, I think it's one of these things where it was a policy that had kind of been ignored for years, and so when everything hits the fan like it did for the last 24 months, your reaction puts you way over here, and eventually it'll come back. But it has really been interesting right now to see how the league is trying to handle these investigations. And when you have them from a team standpoint, what you've got to do is balance the players' rights under the Constitution. You're innocent until you're proven guilty. At least that's the way it's supposed to work. The media takes a different tack sometimes. But the players' rights with public relations, with player relations within inside, Ray Caruth I had to deal with years ago too, and we're trying to say we'd love to distance ourselves from Ray pretty quickly, but you can't. I mean, what do you tell the rest of the players? Oh, if you get accused of something, you're out of here. Well, you're not going to get a lot of loyalty and build much of a team if that's your attitude. So you've got to do that, and it really is a delicate act, and we address it on a daily basis when we get in the middle of one of those things, and hopefully it'll be another 10 or 15 years, if at all, before it happens again with us. But that's kind of lost my train of thought there, but that's where we had to really have some issues, and the league is really trying to work hard to do it right because they've done it wrong for a while now.
We've been fortunate on the Hurricanes specifically to not have any issues in don't remember how many years ago, it was Jeff O'Neill was arrested for indecent exposure because he decided to urinate after leaving the bar instead of at the bar. And it was a blip on the radar screen because it was 10 years ago. We have not had any issues since then, especially in season. We did have a couple players get arrested at a bachelor party in Canada in the off season. But there's nothing that was major that would cause a public outcry under today's standards. You've got Patrick Kane in Chicago, and the issues going on there that the league they've shared with the governors, they've shared internally how they're approaching it, and it's not, they're really looking at balancing the players' rights under the CBA and the Constitution versus the desire to take an immediate stance and that gut reaction, and making sure that they've also got to maintain the integrity of the sport. So this is a test case really for the NHL, which for the most part doesn't have as many issues as the NBA and the NFL.
Although you're the one sport where there have been criminal prosecutions for activity
yes.
in the field of play. So.
Yes, we had one player who, when he was in the juniors, was charged and went to jail for attempted murder for on-ice activity. Nice guy, actually. That was before he came to play with us, and I believe he still lives in the Triangle area.
As you are projecting out, what are going to be the big challenges and the emerging challenges for you as a general counsel? What do you see on the horizon? Is it a big new issue, or do you think things are going to be pretty much the same as they've been for the last 5-10 years?
I think we've already seen it with the emergence of social media and YouTube, and as it relates to police activities. You're going to see that with player behavior. You're going to see that all over the place. The prevalence of technology in our world is going to, and has already blurred the lines on what some people think is acceptable behavior in terms of the anonymous postings. You get into, as Richard alluded to, a call about a social media contest this morning using the trademarks. And we've got people that have to monitor social media, and as that grows exponentially, you're going to have a larger staff that have to control that, and controlling the message of the team and the organization through the social media is an issue. FanDuel and DraftKings and all the fantasy sports is blurring the lines now between fun and gambling, and where that falls, we really just have to wait and see. But I'll tell you that 2 weeks ago, it was 2 weeks ago when that came out, that there were several teams in the NHL that had literally just signed sponsorship deals with several daily fantasy sports leagues. And right after those deals were signed, the NHL sent out their new rules regarding daily fantasy sports. So we had to, every contract that we have for sponsorship and basically everything says, this agreement is subordinate to the Constitution, bylaws, rules, regulations of the National Hockey League and the commissioner and his designees. So anytime there's a change in those, the contract is automatically amended to match those changes. And several of us said, wait a second, if we go back on these deals, we're going to have some issues. So as we said, the owners of the teams own and operate the league. But enough of us pushed back. The league is looking into it, and I was told to sit tight moving forward with some of those, because they didn't, as Richard said, he holds his nose. They didn't make business sense and could have blown up a lot of money in sponsorships for really no tangible benefit. So I think that blurring the lines is the big picture for the next year or so. And as technology continues to expand and develop, even more so.
Yeah, I would agree. Not that I ever did anything wrong when I was at Duke, but thank God you didn't have YouTube and every cell phone had a.
Amen.
Yeah. I mean, y'all live in such a different world that you really voluntarily give up a lot of privacy, and if you haven't voluntarily given it up, somebody's going to take it from you anyway. And you got to remember that these players in all these sports are 20 to 30 years old, most of them. A few of them are in their 30s. And you give 20-something-year-olds a few $1,000,000 to go have fun, and they're going to have fun, and they're going to do some stupid stuff. And it's remarkable to me sometimes how well behaved most of the guys are. At our club, really, we've had a couple of outliers, but most of them are really good people. They're family people. They give back to the community. They do the right thing. But then you get people that, they take a picture of themselves driving 120 miles an hour down the interstate and post it on whatever they're posting it on and say, isn't this cool? Well, dummy, you're not supposed to do that. But so trying to educate the players to do the right things, trying to monitor our intellectual property rights, as Billy alluded to, and I think the NFL in 2014 shut down something like 3,000 counterfeit websites that were selling either counterfeit merchandise or they were doing something. But every time you knock on there, it's like whack-a-mole. You get them over here and they pop up right over here. These folks, it's a cost of doing business. They don't care anything about it. They can just keep going, and it's a never-ending battle. And I think that social media is so far out in front of the laws that regulate it, and it'll probably continue to be that way. It's going to be real interesting. It's going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, there's one thing to add on is that to keep in perspective about the players is that 90% of them did not have the background that all of you had. If you look at in the education, you look at hockey specifically, hockey players, they grow up just like everybody else in elementary school, middle school, where they're the best and they get that pressure all the time. But in Canada, hockey players who have promise go to the junior leagues at age 15, where they go off and they live with a family, and they are essentially playing semi-pro hockey, living with somebody else's family, getting a stipend for room and board. They don't have their parents around to help guide them, and everybody's telling them how great they are. It inspires a lot of misbehavior, so we are very lucky that in hockey we don't have it. But jumping on the technology thing, one more I wanted to point out was that the boxing fight this summer with Mayweather, and I don't remember the name of the site where they were transmitting the broadcast. What was it? Yes, Periscope. That's going to be a big issue for leagues now, is how to deal with, just like with scalping. For years we went and we were beating down the scalpers and it was whack-a-mole. And now it's how can you take that technology for Periscope and integrate it into your platform? How can you make it an asset instead of an enemy? And that's an approach that the leagues are trying to take for all the problems that we had, is how can you convert it to an asset rather than fighting it?
Open it up to questions.
Sure.
Questions from anybody? No? Yes.
How much time do you spend working with local city governments or state governments? It seems like the cities a lot of times are pretty invested in making sure your ownership group wants to stay in that city as opposed to move somewhere else.
We got real involved with state and local officials 2 or 3 years ago when we went and asked them for a bunch of money. Ours was kind of a unique situation. When we got the franchise, we asked the city to put the land together for us to have a stadium, which they did, and we rent it for $1 a year. I mean, it's a deal for us. It's 34 acres in downtown Charlotte, and we pay $1 a year for it. We also got a surprise bill from the county tax collector, though, that was based on the fair market value of the land, not what we were paying on rent. And there's this thing in North Carolina called but anyway, a leasehold estate in exempt property is taxable. And I think we may be the only taxpayer paying the tax and have been for a long time. We've kind of argued that's not really fair, but bottom line is if you lease public property from a public entity for less than what somebody deems fair market value, then you have to pay tax on the difference. And they didn't really know how to calculate it, so they said, okay, well, fine, we'll just say, here's what the fair market value of the land is, and that's what you'll pay the tax on. And we said, well, part of that lease was we had to build a stadium that cost us $180 million that you get to keep at the end of the lease. And we can only use it for football purposes. And if we don't have a franchise, then we don't get to keep the land anymore, so we can't develop it into something else. So ultimately, we got a reduction on it. But that's a long way of saying the city invested about $35 million at the beginning. We invested a couple $100 million. We went back to them a couple of years ago and said, we've got a 20-year-old stadium. We need to make some improvements. We're not asking you to make an economic investment based on what somebody says the economic impact is going to be on this region. We can show you what our impact has been. Your tax revenues, your new businesses, everything else has been tremendously benefited by our presence. We'd like you to make an investment with us and help us out. City agreed to do it. We gave them an agreement not to leave for 10 years in exchange for that. The state said, thanks, but no thanks. We're not going to give you any money. And even though they benefit probably more than the city does because of the income taxes that all our players pay and all the visiting teams players pay and everybody else. So Billy and I deal with state level folks a lot on some other issues. So there's a fair amount of interaction with public officials. We try to minimize it as much as we can. Because, of course, every time you go talk to somebody, then you get a call within a week. Well, I got this campaign coming up, and we need a little help over here, too. So it's an interesting business.
Yeah, I don't deal with local officials as much. A lot of those conversations are more on the operational level, related to police, fire, EMS. But as Richard said, he and I work together on a lot of the state issues and the legislative work and lobbying. Taxes, unfortunately, is in our radar screen for too many years.
Yeah.
I think I saw one other hand, and then we'll.
I was going to say, you were talking about ticketing. Is there any interaction with websites like StubHub and Ticketmaster? Is that a relationship, or is that kind of just something that's more out of your control?
Well, the NFL and the Panthers have a relationship with Ticketmaster.
So like StubHub, is there interaction between that? Do you have to regulate how they sell your tickets or anything?
They're free to be a marketplace for them. We just have the official website, the official ticket partner is Ticketmaster. We went through something recently. North Carolina's scalping law said you can't sell a ticket for more than $3 over face value. And then it actually changed where if you're selling it online, as long as the StubHub or Ticketmaster or whoever it is guarantees to the purchaser that it's a valid ticket and that they can get entry if they buy that ticket, and they'll reimburse them if they're denied entry, then you can sell it for whatever you can get for it. So it was a gap or a hole in the scalping laws that we basically created because we were trying to protect the fans. Otherwise, we know they're paying premiums. A lot of times they're paying a premium on the street for a paper ticket that sometimes looks good and sometimes it doesn't, but they get upset when they can't get in.
Need to thank both of you. This has been really interesting. And we're talking about gambling and social media. One of the Rockets
Thanks.
interviewed
Thanks,
a
everybody.
guy who had made a ton of money gambling. He had an algorithm